Most people believe that once you cross 45, your financial story is already written, that whatever you've saved or failed to save is more or less your destiny. But let me tell you something. I've seen people with decades of income behind them and almost nothing to show for it. And it wasn't because they didn't work hard. If you appreciate calm, honest conversations about money like this, consider liking, subscribing, and sharing. It helps this message reach people who need it. And if this already resonates with you, write reset in the comments. I read them all, and it tells me exactly what kind of conversations we should keep having here. Let me tell you something that most people don't realize until it's much later than they'd like. Earning money and building wealth are not the same thing. You see, I've met thousands of people over the years, smart people, hardworking people, disciplined people, and many of them made a very comfortable living. On paper, they were doing everything right. Promotions, raises, steady careers. If you looked from the outside, you'd assume they were financially secure. But here's the interesting thing. A surprising number of them weren't. And the reason is something I like to call the wealth illusion. It's the belief that as long as your income keeps going up, your financial life must be improving. That progress is measured by your paycheck. And for a while, that feels true. You earn more. You breathe easier. You upgrade your life just a little, then a little more. And before you know it, your entire financial identity is tied to your ability to keep earning. Now, that may sound reasonable. After all, we're taught from a young age that income is the goal. Study hard, get a good job, earn more each year. That's the script. But here's where it quietly breaks down. Income is active. Wealth is passive. Income depends on you showing up. Wealth continues even when you don't. And if you think about it, that's a very important difference, especially after 45. Because at some point, whether we like it or not, our time, energy, and opportunities begin to narrow, not disappear, but narrow. And when that happens, relying on income alone becomes a fragile strategy. Let me give you a simple way to see this. Imagine two people. One earns a very high salary, spends most of it, and saves a little here and there. The other earns less, but steadily buys assets, small pieces of businesses, investments that produce income, things that quietly grow over time. 10, 15, 20 years pass. The first person looks successful, nice lifestyle, good income. But the moment they stop working, everything pauses. The second person may have looked ordinary along the way, nothing flashy. But over time, they built something that works for them, even when they're not working. That's the difference between working for money and having money work for you. And most people, especially those who feel behind later in life, are still caught in that first pattern. They're running harder, trying to earn more, believing that one more raise, one more opportunity, one more push will fix everything. But here's the uncomfortable truth. If the structure underneath your finances hasn't changed, more income doesn't solve the problem. It simply scales it. That may sound simple, but it matters, because I've noticed over the years that people rarely feel poor because of what they earn. They feel poor because of what they keep, and more importantly, what they own. Ownership is the missing piece. You see, when you own something productive, whether it's a business, a share of a company, or an asset that generates income, you're no longer starting from zero every month. Something is already working in the background. But when you rely only on income, every month begins the same way. You start at zero, and you trade your time to climb back up again. That's a treadmill, not a strategy. And here's where it becomes especially important after 45. Time becomes more valuable than ever. Not because you're running out of it, but because every year needs to count a little more. Which brings us to a quiet question most people avoid asking themselves. If you stopped working tomorrow, what would still be working for you? Don't answer that too quickly. Because the answer to that question reveals something deeper than income ever could. It reveals whether you've been building wealth or simply maintaining a lifestyle. And in the next part, we're going to look at something even more subtle, something that quietly keeps people stuck in that cycle, even when they're earning more than they ever thought they would. It's not what you think. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Now, let's take that idea a little further, because this is where things become uncomfortable, but also incredibly useful. You see, once you understand that income isn't the same as wealth, the next question becomes obvious. If people are earning more than ever before, why aren't they getting ahead? And the answer isn't usually dramatic, it's quiet. It hides in plain sight. I've noticed over the years that most financial problems don't come from big mistakes. They come from small, repeated decisions that feel harmless at the time. Let me explain. As income grows, so does something else, expectation. You earn more, so naturally you improve your lifestyle, a better home, a nicer car, more comfort, more convenience, nothing extreme, just upgrades, and each one feels deserved, reasonable. But here's the interesting thing, those upgrades don't just cost money today, they commit your future income, and that's where the hidden trap begins. Because slowly, almost invisibly, you build a structure where your life requires you to keep earning at the same level or higher, just to stand still. Now, that may not feel like a problem in your 30s or even early 40s. You're still moving forward. Opportunities are still expanding, but after 4 or 5 weeks, that structure becomes heavier. And most people don't notice it until they try to slow down. Let me give you a simple picture. Imagine you're carrying a bucket, and every year your income increases. Someone pokes a few tiny holes in the bottom, nothing dramatic. You don't even notice at first a slightly bigger mortgage, a car payment that stretches a little longer. Subscriptions, insurance, maintenance upgrades. Individually, they're manageable. Together, they create a slow leak. So you keep pouring more water into the bucket, working harder, earning more. But the level never rises the way you expect. That's what I call the leaky bucket problem. And here's the part most people miss. It's not about how much you make. It's about how much escapes without building anything lasting. Now, if you've ever felt like your income disappears faster than it grows, write leak in the comments. You're not alone. And more importantly, you're starting to see what most people never do. You see, most people think in terms of monthly affordability. Can I afford this payment? But investors think differently. They ask, what is this costing me over the next 10, 20, 30 years? Because every dollar you commit to consumption is a dollar that can't compound. And compounding, whether people realize it or not, is the quiet engine behind every real fortune. So when lifestyle expands faster than ownership, something subtle happens. Your future gets sold off piece by piece in exchange for comfort today. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't enjoy your life. That's not the point. The point is awareness. Because I've seen people earning very good incomes who are, in reality, financially trapped. Not because they made a catastrophic mistake, but because they built a life that depends entirely on continued effort. And effort over time becomes less reliable than assets. That may sound like a small distinction, but it's everything, because once your expenses rise to meet your income, you lose flexibility, you lose optionality, and without realizing it, you trade freedom for stability. And here's the deeper issue. Even if you manage to control spending, even if you plug the leaks, avoiding mistakes alone doesn't create wealth. It only stops the bleeding. So the real question becomes, if not income and not just cutting expenses, then what actually builds something that lasts? That's where the conversation shifts. Because at some point, you have to stop thinking like someone who earns money and start thinking like someone who owns something. And that's a very different mindset. It's quieter, slower, less exciting perhaps, but it's also where everything begins to change. You see, the moment you stop chasing income and start acquiring assets, even small ones, you step onto a completely different path. A path where time starts working for you instead of against you. And in the next part, I want to show you something most people misunderstand about investing, especially later in life. It's not about being smarter. It's not about taking bigger risks. In fact, it's almost the opposite. And once you see it, you'll realize that building wealth isn't as complicated as it's often made to seem. But it does require one thing most people never fully adopt, a different way of thinking. Now, let me show you something that tends to surprise people. Building wealth is rarely about doing more. It's about doing less, but doing it consistently and doing it right. You see, once you've stepped out of that cycle of chasing income and reacting to expenses, something changes. You begin to see money differently, not as something to spend or even save, but as something to deploy. That may sound simple, but it's a completely different mindset. Most people treat investing like a form of activity. They feel they need to constantly adjust, react, optimize. They watch the news, follow trends, worry about timing. But I've noticed over the years, the people who do the best financially are often the least active. They don't confuse motion with progress. Let me give you an image I've used many times. Think of wealth like a snowball rolling downhill. At the beginning, it's small, almost insignificant. You push it, and it barely grows. It can feel discouraging, especially if you're starting later in life. But here's the interesting thing. If you keep pushing steadily, patiently, the snowball begins to grow. And as it grows, something changes. It starts to pick up more snow on its own. It gains momentum. And eventually it becomes large enough that gravity does most of the work for you. That's compounding. Now, most people understand compounding in theory, but very few experience it in practice. And the reason is simple. They interrupt it. They pull money out too early. They chase better opportunities. They react to fear. They look for shortcuts. They try to speed it up. And in doing so, they slow it down. That's one of the great ironies of investing. Trying to get rich faster is often what keeps people from getting rich at all. Now, that doesn't mean you ignore everything. It doesn't mean you never adjust. But it does mean that once you have a sound approach, something built on quality, discipline, and time, you let it work. You see, most people want intensity. They want big wins, quick results, clear signals that they're on the right track. But wealth, real wealth, tends to grow quietly. It doesn't announce itself every month. It doesn't give you constant reassurance. In fact, for long stretches, it can feel like nothing is happening. And that's where most people give up, because they mistake silence for failure. But if you think about it, the most important processes in life are often invisible. A tree doesn't grow by making noise. It grows by staying rooted, and investing is very similar. Now, here's the practical side of this, because philosophy is only useful if it leads to action. If you're over 45, your advantage is not speed, it's clarity. You don't need to experiment endlessly. You don't need complexity. You don't need 10 different strategies. You need a few sound principles applied consistently. Owning productive assets, reinvesting returns, controlling costs, avoiding unnecessary risk, and most importantly, staying the course. That last one is harder than it sounds, because the world will constantly tempt you to deviate. There will always be something new, something exciting, something that promises better returns, faster results. And sometimes those opportunities will even work for a while. But over a lifetime, the steady approach tends to win, not because it's more exciting, but because it's more reliable. Now, if you're starting to see money differently, less as something to chase and more as something to build, write build in the comments. That shift right there is where everything begins to change. You see, the quiet strategy isn't about brilliance, it's about behavior. And behavior, over time, compounds just like money does. Small decisions, repeated consistently. Over years, even decades, that's how wealth is built. Not in bursts, but in layers. And here's something most people don't fully appreciate until much later. The earlier you stop interrupting the process, the more powerful it becomes, even if you start later than you'd like, which brings us to something deeper. Because at this point, you might be thinking, that all makes sense, but I've already lost time. And that's a fair thought. In fact, it's one of the most common concerns I hear, but here's the truth. Time is not the problem. Misuse time is. You see, people often think of time as something that works against them. Especially after 45, they feel like the clock is ticking, like opportunities are shrinking. But time itself is neutral. It becomes your ally or your enemy based on how you use it. Let me explain. Imagine two people, both 50 years old. One spends the next 15 years continuing the same patterns, earning, spending, saving a little, but never really investing with intention. The other decides to change course. They simplify. They invest consistently. They avoid unnecessary risks. They let compounding do its work. Now, neither of them can go back and reclaim the past. But over those 15 years, their futures begin to look very different, because time, when combined with the right behavior, still compounds. Maybe not as dramatically as if they had started at 25, but significantly enough to matter. And that's the part most people underestimate. They think if they didn't start early, it's not worth starting at all. But that's like saying if you didn't plant a tree 20 years ago, you shouldn't plant one today. The best time may have passed, but the second best time is still incredibly valuable. And more importantly, it's still available. Now, that doesn't mean you ignore reality. Starting later requires discipline. It requires focus. It requires fewer mistakes. But it also comes with an advantage, experience. By this stage in life, you've seen enough to recognize what doesn't work. You've felt the consequences of certain decisions. You understand risk in a more personal way. And that perspective, if used correctly, can be incredibly powerful, because investing is not just about numbers. It's about behavior under uncertainty. And people who have lived a little tend to handle that better if they choose to. So the question is not, is it too late? The question is, will I finally align my behavior with how money actually works? That's a very different question, and it leads to a very different outcome. You see, most people focus on what they've lost, time, opportunities, missed chances, but investors focus on what still compounds. And as long as time is moving forward, something can still grow. That may sound simple, but it changes everything, because once you stop looking backward and start working with time instead of against it, you regain control, not over the past, but over what happens next. And in the end, that's what this is really about. Not perfection, not catching up to anyone else, but finally stepping onto a path that, if followed patiently, leads somewhere solid, somewhere stable, somewhere that doesn't depend entirely on how hard you can work, but on how wisely you've chosen to build. And that, more than anything, is what turns time from a source of pressure into your greatest financial ally.